April 8th was Sine Die, day for the General Assembly in Latin, meaning without a day, or in normal parlance, time's up, boys. This year, General Assembly was puttering around right along according to a non-election year schedule, and then tragedy struck when the Francis Scott Key Bridge was demolished. In a remarkable display of cooperation, the General Assembly passed the Port Act to provide economic relief for workers and businesses that rely on the partially closed Port of Baltimore. It also passed all 16 of Governor Moore's favorite bills dedicated to public safety, housing affordability, economic competitiveness, and public service. Mike, was this a successful legislative session? Was there a signature piece that passed this year?
I think it was a solid session. I think it was, I think one of the challenges you run into, and I think in Maryland we are learning this, is we had a governor, Republican, and a Democratic assembly. And so there was always some tension there. And everyone assumes that, once you get a Democratic governor, everyone's of the same party, then things become very easy. And I think the reality is that that actually can make things more difficult because everyone assumes you're on the same team, which generally you are, but you now actually have to align your priorities. And oftentimes that can be difficult. And I think through this session, that I think the governor was clear what he was trying to do, but I think he also worked well with the General Assembly, and I think they worked well with him. I think there were a couple points in the session where it looked like things were kind of going off the rails. When the House indicated they want to increase taxes significantly, the Senate indicated that they didn't. The governor then extended the provided the opportunity to extend the session. It looked like things were going to kind of go a little sideways, and everybody came back together. And I think part of it, you alluded to this, I think once you actually have a real world situation like what happened with the Francis Scott Key Bridge, people kind of hunker down and go, oh, wait, we can get these other things taken care of, and let's focus on the big things. And so I think that's what happened. And so if there was a signature issue, I think it actually was getting a budget done in a timely fashion and how they came together to address the bridge issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, what was your view?
Well, boy, do I miss Larry Hogan as governor, because for 8 years, we had an absolute red line in terms of tax increases and fee increases. And this was a legislative session that was dominated by talk of some fairly high, some very stiff tax increases and fee increases. And as Mike alluded to or mentioned, they got whittled down to a smaller increase, but an increase nonetheless that, frankly, in this circumstances was not necessary except to enable increased spending.
I will say, since I was involved in a couple of the pieces of legislation on behalf of the Maryland Land Title Association, some of the legislation that was proposed by the governor could have been crafted better. And I know that the majority of them passed, but I know there was concern about some of the language, and we're probably going to have to address those things in the next session. But anyway, Mike, we can get into the budget in a minute, but we've already talked about the significance of the Port Act, and what does that do for Marylanders?
Well, I think it's one of those things the things that we take for granted, right? And people don't necessarily recognize the role that the Port of Maryland Port of Baltimore plays in our overall economy. And I think, and the ripple effects that has. And so I've got a number of folks that work for me who have relatives that are working various aspects of the port, whether it's having restaurants that are feeding workers or who are actually working as longshoremen. And the reality is that within hours of the tragedy, that people were being notified that their jobs were going to be potentially eliminated for the time being because no one knew what was going to happen next. You saw traffic and slowing down to a trickle at restaurants, and so you saw the economic impact almost immediately. And I don't think people fully appreciate that and understand the role that has, not just there, but for the broader state economy. And so I think that was a real wake-up call. But I think, as can be the case, people have come together to really identify it, recognize it, and put the resources in place to address those individuals and work quickly to address what was a really challenging issue. Is it a very challenging issue?
So, Mark, I'm going to pivot to you to talk about the budget. Montgomery County Delegate Mark Corman, who chairs the House Environment and Transportation Committee, said that the passage of the budget, which made long-term investments in education and a down payment on transportation projects, was probably the most important thing that passed this year. What's your opinion?
Well, I mean, the long-term budget challenge that Maryland has faced for a number of years and will continue to in the future is the increases that are part of the Kerwin blueprint in education. Ramps up spending in a number of categories, and sort of squaring that circle, so to speak, of coming up with the money to fund that is a challenge both at the state level and at the county level, because they have a share of that too. So when we talk about quote unquote long-term investments, really what we're talking about is that challenge of those increases, figuring out a way to accommodate that if they go forward.
Mike, any thoughts on the budget?
Yeah, no, I think it is an interesting challenge. I even think the taxes they increased on tobacco and some of the fees, one of the challenges everyone continues to raise, and Mark alluded to this, is the notion of a structural deficit. And we're seeing that out there. And a lot of that happened because there were one-time revenues that came in from the feds to help us react to COVID. And this investment in education was passed at the same time, which I think kind of masked what the impact of that was going to ultimately be. And the challenge that we have is how do we both look at spending that we don't need to have, and how do we identify those revenue sources that are actually going to be sustainable revenue sources? We've seen this with the gas tax. We've seen this with tobacco taxes. There are things that we can fund. There are things we can raise taxes on, but they generate declining revenue. And so it's not ultimately doesn't address the systemic issue that we have. And haven't seen a proposal that allows us to really think about how we're going to get there from here.
Well, this is a 20-year problem. I mean, we saw it with Thornton. We saw it with Kerwin. We have unfunded mandates that have to be paid for somehow. And the legislature has not been good about trying to address those issues. It's a bit frustrating, to see this repeated year in and year out.
Oh, no, I agree. And having been a council member after Thornton was passed, and we were expecting to see resources, and we didn't see those resources, but we had the expectation of things we were supposed to be doing at the county level, becomes a real challenge. And you'd like to think that 10 years, 12 years later, we would have learned how not to have done that. And the reality is that we are enthusiastic about making an important investment in our educational system and in our students and our children. I think that's important. But how do we do that and make that sustainable so that we ultimately see the outcomes we want to see?
So I'm going to stick with you, Mike. The General Assembly passed a bill sponsored by Montgomery County Delegate David Moon to regulate the use of facial recognition by law enforcement. What do you think of that?
I have to say, and going back and looking at what was passed and looking at the consensus that appeared to come together to ultimately get that passed, I was quite impressed in that we've been working where people are kind of get at odds with police and law enforcement and policymakers. And this appears to be a situation where law enforcement have been using facial recognition, but now there's some structure to it, but we've actually figured out how to allow them to continue doing it in a way that makes sense and put some guiding principles out there that law enforcement, civil rights folks and policymakers can come together to say, this makes sense. It sounds like we're more robust here than in some other states, but others are taking similar actions. And I guess, given the tension that I've seen out there over the last 4 or 5 years and not working closely with law enforcement to achieve our broader community objectives, this seems to be an instance where everybody came to the table and worked hard to get something that would make sense for law enforcement to do their job better and for the community to be stronger.
Mark, do you agree?
Well, I'm hopeful that Mike is right. I think that and clearly, how can I say at the outset, it certainly gave me considerable concern that here's a potentially great tool of identifying people who are perhaps wanted, have warrants out, that facial recognition can be very helpful in doing that. I think particularly in the United Kingdom, it's a tool that is used fairly actively in law enforcement.
I'm hopeful that it won't hinder law enforcement in doing their work. So we don't have much time left. I want to just touch on one last topic, which is Pimlico. Why in the world are we spending money on Pimlico? Mike, you first, then Mark. We got about 30 seconds left.
Tradition, and we don't want to lose the tradition, but I'm not sure it makes sense to make that investment. And I'll be very curious to see what happens if we ever have a Preakness there again, or just how it plays out. I'm dubious.
All right, Mark, last word.
Preakness is an unbelievably expensive party for Maryland.
All right. And my thought is, if this was a nag, it'd be led off to the glue factory. All right.